Okay, everybody, welcome. We are doing our sixth session on questionnaire design. We have looked at different aspects of the protocol. We've looked at the writing the format of the protocol, how do you find your question. We've looked at different types of study designs, doing the literature review. And now we are at the part where we have to design a questionnaire for our study. How do we go about that? Tanya is going to be doing our presentation today. Please remember that you need to IM in the message box if you have a question. Please message Leandra if you have any questions regarding your access into the webinar. If you have difficulty, Leandra's email is still the same as the last time. All of you should have it. Send a private message if you need to. Then also for the webinar rules, please remember that we are switching off your mics, but if in the event that your mic goes on again, please mute it. The way you do that, at the bottom of your screen, the second button, there's a microphone. If you click on it, it should have a line that goes across. That means that you are muted, and we'd prefer for you to message us into the message window on the left-hand side of the screen. If your video happens to go on, please switch it off. That's the first button at the bottom. It uses some more bandwidth, which makes our connection slightly poorer. As the last time, we will be having polls in the webinar. So Tanya will indicate when it's time for you to participate in the poll. What you can do is you'll click on your selection, whether you're using your tablet or your laptop, to indicate your answer. I'm handing over to Tanya.
Hi everybody. So basically what we're going to try to do today is to firstly understand the different ways in which quantitative information can be gathered using a questionnaire. Secondly, to know the difference between designing a questionnaire from scratch and modifying an existing tool, and to also know when it's necessary to do each of these. Then we're going to be looking at the steps in designing a questionnaire from scratch, and then just very briefly the need to look at validity and reliability testing of your new or modified tools. So obviously we can't go into all of this in a huge amount of depth in this short time that we have together, but let's try to just understand all the different aspects so that we at least have a starting point. In this webinar, we're actually changing track from the previous webinar, which was on qualitative research, and here we're actually focusing on quantitative research. Basically, exploratory questionnaires can be used to collect information which is more qualitative in nature and won't be statistically analyzed. However, when we're doing quantitative research, we need to use formal, standardized questionnaires. And these are the best to use if the researcher is using to test and quantify hypotheses, or the data is going to be statistically analyzed. So our formal standardized questionnaires are usually characterized by having prescribed wording and order of questions, prescribed definitions and explanations for each question, to ensure that the interviewers handle the questions consistently and can answer respondents' requests for clarification if they occur. Thirdly, it has a prescribed response format to enable rapid completion of the questionnaire, as opposed to sort of open-ended responses. Okay, so we're going to be concentrating on formal standardized questionnaires in this webinar. Just this little cartoon, I don't know if you can read the writing there. Basically, the man who's being interviewed is saying, the way I feel is hard to quantify, and the woman who's taking the questionnaire is saying, how hard on a scale of 1 to 10. So that's basically making light of the situation that what we try to do in quantitative questionnaires is to quantify information from people, even if it's feelings or attitudes or something like that, which are sometimes quite difficult to quantify. So let's sort of see how this whole thing fits into the process, the overall process of research. Probably a bit difficult for you to see this. We will make the slides available to you afterwards, so you can look and see what the writing here says. But basically, I'll talk you through that. The design of the questionnaire usually takes place after an initial exploratory research phase, where the issues to be studied are actually thoroughly explored. It's important because if you're designing a new questionnaire from scratch, for instance, you might not know what are the issues that actually need to be put into your questionnaire. Let's just say, for example, you're a public health doctor, and you practicing in a rural clinic and you want to conduct research on factors influencing women's decisions to screen for cervical cancer or not. And you might not actually know on the ground what are the issues affecting these women that you're doing research on. So you might first have to conduct some exploratory research. Only once you know what to ask can you formulate these issues into a formal standardized questionnaire. And then even after the exploratory phase, 2 steps remain to be completed before the task of designing the questionnaire can commence. Firstly, you have to articulate the research questions that you want to ask. And secondly, to determine the hypotheses around which these questions are to be designed. So you have to have a clear idea on what is your research question, and if you have any hypotheses, those need to be clearly articulated. Sometimes it might not be necessary for you to design a new questionnaire from the beginning up. Maybe there's already a tool available. Maybe somebody else has done a very similar project or study to you and are willing to let you use or adapt their questionnaire. You can always, you will come across other research in your literature review part of your protocol, so you could possibly make contact with the researcher and ask permission to use their questionnaire. Sometimes they might charge you money for doing that, or they might want to be a co-author or co-investigator in your project, in which case it would be up to you to decide what you would want to do there. So the message I'm trying to get across is don't reinvent the wheel unless you have to. By reinvent the wheel, I mean go through the whole process of designing a new questionnaire from scratch if there already is an existing one, and if that the person who owns the rights to that existing tool has given you permission or can give you permission to use it. Because as you'll see, it's quite a long, lengthy and tedious process to design a questionnaire from scratch. The advantages of using an existing tool is that, of course, then you can compare your study results with those of other studies that have used the same instrument, because now you're comparing apples with apples. If another study has asked exactly the same questions as you, you can now compare your responses. So that really is a huge advantage. And definitely it saves you time and effort if you can just use or adapt existing questionnaires. However, sometimes you may need to modify existing instruments. Some instruments were designed to be used in specific populations and have very culture-specific questions. An existing questionnaire might be extremely long and you might want to shorten it a little bit. Maybe the time that you have to spend collecting your fieldwork or spending with your participants is not very long, and you also don't want to put people off by having such a long questionnaire. So you can maybe modify an existing tool if it's too long. If you are modifying an existing tool, you have to consider what would happen to the existing scales. So for instance, if you've got a scale measuring, let's say, a construct like depression, it might be made up of 36 questions, 36 individual items. And if you take away any of those items to shorten the questionnaire, is it still actually measuring what it's supposed to be measuring? Okay, so the validity of the questionnaire might get affected if you remove items. And that will have implications on how you score the questionnaire as well. So the scoring system was probably designed for the original number of items, and if you remove some of those items to shorten the questionnaire, you could run into problems later. So it would need, if you're going to be adapting existing tools, definitely you're going to need to consider another round of validity and reliability testing, just to make sure that the changes that you've made to that questionnaire are not going to have too much of an impact on how you analyze the data and the interpretations made from that data. I also just want to give you an example of culture-specific questions. When I said an existing tool might be too culture-specific and you have to adapt it to your particular population's culture. An example is we were looking at older populations in South Africa in the rural areas of KwaZulu-Natal, and we wanted to measure the amount of physical activity that the older people were undergoing. So there was already an existing questionnaire measuring this in older populations, but it had been designed by researchers in the Netherlands. Okay, it was a Dutch questionnaire. And of course, as you know, in the Netherlands, people ride bicycles a lot and garden and, do sort of a lot of leisure activities, which our populations might not do. So the questions were all about leisure activities such as walking and riding a bicycle and gardening and that for leisure. And we had to remove those questions because in our populations, that sort of activity was not done for leisure. It was more a necessity, out of necessity. So that's just my point on modifying existing tools if they are too culture specific. Right. So now let's go on to why it might actually be possible or it might be necessary to design a questionnaire from scratch. We've spoken about possibly modifying existing tools and not reinventing the wheel unless we really have to. So if there's no standard questionnaires available, what do we do if nobody has ever researched this current topic that we are looking at the moment, or if it's a very specialized field of research that we're wanting to do and we cannot find any other tool in the literature or any other study that's been done using a similar tool or something that we need. So if there's no standard questionnaires available, then yes, we might have to consider that we'd have to start from scratch, from the beginning, designing a questionnaire. Also, if there are existing instruments or tools or questionnaires available in the literature, but they are inadequate or inappropriate for your study population, and they cannot be modified to be more appropriate. In that case, but in both of those cases, we could possibly consider that we would have to design a new questionnaire from scratch. But just be warned, this process is a very long and difficult process and it's possibly not as easy as you think it is. I don't want to put you off designing questionnaires, but there are a lot of steps you need to go through and there are a lot of things that need to be considered. So what are the qualities of a well-designed questionnaire? Well, it has to, of course, meet your study objectives, which is why you need to have a very clear idea before you start designing your questionnaire about what your specific research objectives are and any hypotheses that you're wanting to test. A well-designed questionnaire will also encourage valid and complete information, right? So it encourages people to be truthful and honest and to complete all the information, because missing data from a questionnaire is something that can be a huge problem in our lives when we're doing quantitative research. So we don't want to encourage people to skip out questions. We want to encourage them to complete all the information in the most valid way that they can. It must also be easy to give the answer and write down or record the answer. So tick boxes, well laid out, is where people can easily see if they have to complete it themselves. If it's a self-administered questionnaire, we want it to be as easy as possible for them to give the answer without having to wonder, how to do it. It must also permit sound analysis and interpretation. So it must be designed with the analysis or with the outcome in mind. So basically we always say, start with the end in mind. So visualize the kind of tables, graphs, statistical tests that you want to be able to do with the results that you get, and then build or design your questionnaire around obtaining information in that particular format. Right, so this cartoon just illustrates the wording at the bottom. If you can't read it, says, "Sorry, sir, but we don't have a category for that." You basically must be able to think about all the possible responses that people can give to the questions that you're asking and be able to capture all those possible responses. But obviously the cartoon is just going overboard a little bit. So what are the general, before we get stuck into what are the steps that we would go through in designing a questionnaire, let's look at the general considerations for what quantitative questionnaires should have. And basically, as far as possible, you want all your questions to be closed-ended. Okay, that means the opposite of open-ended. Open-ended is where you would leave a blank line or lines for people to write or record their responses. Closed-ended questions are where you provide the possible options that people can choose. Apart from closed-ended questions, we need our options to be mutually exclusive and exhaustive. What do we mean by that? Well, mutually exclusive basically means if you've got a question where only one answer is permitted, so you can only choose one option, like a multiple choice question, it must be structured so that the participants can only select one. So only one will be applicable, not a number of options. There are different types of questions where you can let people choose all the options that apply, but in most cases, if it's a multiple choice question, the responses must be mutually exclusive. So if you're one, then you cannot be the other. So you cannot fall into more than one category at a time. And then by exhaustive, what do I mean? I basically mean that all the possible options that a person can have are listed in your closed-ended questions, so that a participant isn't left feeling, well, nothing is really applicable here, so what do I do? I'll just leave out the question. Okay, so that it must encompass all the range of possible options. If in doubt, you could always just include a category for other. Well-defined study goals lead to well-defined questionnaires. So that's just reiterating the fact that before you even start developing your questionnaire, you need to have clearly defined hypotheses or research questions or specific objectives. Okay, because if you don't quite know what it is you're wanting to ask, or what it is you're wanting to study, or what your objectives are, how are you actually going to design your questionnaire? So you must really have a clear idea of all the concepts to be measured. Keep it short and simple. This is probably the most important rule or general consideration here. Please do not make lengthy, wordy questions or questionnaires that are pages and pages of irrelevant information, because people are not going to be very conducive to filling in these long questionnaires. And just think about it, they're actually giving you their time to participate in your study. So the least you can do is keep the questions to the ones that are what you're actually trying to find out. A lot of people, researchers might get tempted to insert all kinds of questions into their questionnaire, even if they have no direct bearing on the study objectives. And that's not really fair on your participants, and also it's not ethical. So if your questionnaire goes through ethical review, your ethics committee will probably pick up the fact that you might have included questions that are actually irrelevant, and you could have done the research without asking those questions. So just be fair to your participants and only ask the relevant questions, and only ask questions if you intend on analyzing them. So don't include a whole lot of questions just because you can. You know, some people think, oh, well, this is my opportunity now, I'm doing this study, I may as well just ask all these questions so that if I ever need them in the future, then I have these, but it's really not fair to do that. So keep it short and simple. You must also ensure that participants' responses will be anonymous and confidential. That also encourages people to participate if they know that there is no sort of way that they can be identified from their responses, especially if it's a sensitive information that you're collecting. Plan the analysis of each question. So you must know for each question you're asking on your questionnaire, there must be a plan for that question. How is it going to be analyzed? How will it fit into the overall objectives and the specific objectives of your particular research project? So again, this sort of reiterates that don't put questions in that you're not going to be analyzing. Okay, so think very carefully about each individual question that you're asking and think how the results are going to be used. Okay, I hope you're all with me so far. So that was just the general steps in designing a questionnaire. We're going to now talk about the actual steps that you need to go through. So the first step would be to decide on the information that's required. Secondly, to choose the method of reaching your target respondents, because that will determine how the format, the wording, and everything of your questionnaire. Then to decide on, for question by question, the content of each question. Then to carefully develop the question in wording. To look at the order of your questions and put them into a meaningful order, and to make it look nice by formatting the whole questionnaire. To check and see whether the length of your questionnaire is appropriate, and to perhaps think about shortening the questionnaire, which you can do in the next step when you're pre-testing or piloting the questionnaire. And this is also to check for, well, we'll go through each of these stages step by step, and I'll tell you more information on each one. And then to consider validity and reliability issues, and finally to finalize. So it's not as quick and easy as you probably thought it would be before attending this webinar. So we'll go through some of these steps individually now. So step one is to decide on what information we require. It's not just simply a matter of writing down questions. I'm sure some of you must have thought, well, it can't be that difficult to design a questionnaire. I'm just going to write down some questions that I want people to answer on a piece of paper, and there we have it. It's not simply a matter of writing the questions down. The first step is to decide what are the things that we need to know from the respondents in order to meet the survey's objectives. To do this, we must list the variables and concepts to be measured. We need to make sure that these variables and concepts actually they correspond with our objectives and our hypotheses. It sounds very obvious, but there are you can actually get very carried away if you think that you're designing a questionnaire about a specific topic and you don't keep your objectives and hypotheses on hand. It actually opens you up to getting carried away and off the topic. So what I would suggest is that you keep your objectives and research hypotheses on a separate piece of paper, print it out in front of you while you are designing your questionnaire, and keep referring to them all the time just to remind yourself this is what I'm actually trying to do in my study. Then once you've made a list of all the variables and concepts to be measured, you can then take each of those variables and label them as are they independent variables, are they dependent variables, or are they confounders? So this would be specifically for research studies that try to look at associations between exposures and outcomes. So like in operations research, our outcome might be, we might be wanting to know the prevalence of multi-drug resistant TB in our hospital, let's say. So that would be the dependent variable, whether the patient has multi-drug resistant TB or not. The independent variables, depending on, you might have another hypothesis related to that, saying what are the factors associated with developing multi-drug resistant TB. And you would list all the different independent variables and confounders that the literature has identified or previous research has identified, and that would be that you would need to measure all of those things as well in your study. Because bear in mind that confounders, if they are not measured, you cannot control for them or adjust for them in the analysis of your data. So it's important at this stage to identify all the possible confounders so that you can measure them. And if you don't know what they are, you can identify them usually from the literature. Also consider the limitations of your study design. For instance, if you're doing a cross-sectional study, you can't assess temporality. So you can't assess whether the exposure came before the outcome, which would be a criteria for establishing causality. However, you can possibly ask, in the way that you structure your questionnaire, you could possibly ask in the question about whether that exposure was there before the outcome occurred. So if you're asking maybe if people are smokers, you might want to ask how long have they been smoking for. So in a cross-sectional study, you'd be able to get some sort of idea of the time aspect of that exposure by asking that in the questionnaire. Step 2 was on choosing the method of reaching your target population. So firstly, you must define your target respondents. So you think about the population that you wish to generalize to from the sample of data to be collected. For example, in medical research, researchers often either study patients with a condition or healthcare providers. Both groups have very different levels of education which need to be taken into account. Secondly, you have to draw up a sampling frame. So that would be a list of all the potential or possible members of the population. And thirdly, in designing the questionnaire, we must take into account factors such as age, education, etc. of the target population. So in my example of a study using the patients with a specific condition, they might be representative of the man on the street and have a variety of education levels. So you wouldn't pitch your questionnaire at too high a level. Whereas if you were using healthcare providers as your target population, you know that they are educated to a certain level, and therefore you can use more sophisticated language and so on. Then the next step is to choose the method of reaching your target respondents. So how you plan to administer the questionnaire will determine on the types of questions you ask, the wording, the language, the length of the questionnaires, and the format. It might seem strange to be suggesting that the method of reaching the intended respondent should constitute part of the questionnaire design process. However, you'll probably realize that it will have a direct bearing on how you phrase the questions. The main methods available are personal interviews, so sort of one-on-one interviewing the participant, or you could use mailed or internet questionnaires, which would be self-administered by the respondents, or you could use telephone interviews. The latter, the telephone interviews, aren't really used so much nowadays, especially with the advent of cellular phones, but in the past it was possible to do random digit dialing in a particular area code as a proxy to simple random sampling. Nowadays, as we know, cell phones don't have area codes, so you can't be sure where your participants are if you're using that method. But each method has their advantages and disadvantages. The personal interviews are probably the best way, the gold standard of collecting the information, because you have that personal contact with the participant. If there are any questions that they don't understand, they can ask you for clarity. However, the disadvantage would be that it would take a lot of time and possibly expense. You might have to hire field workers to collect your information for you, because interviewing each participant personally can take a lot of time and effort. The second way is to either mail the questionnaires or use internet questionnaires, or drop off a whole bunch of questionnaires with your target population for them to complete on their own. And that obviously has the advantage of being a lot more time saving, but it assumes literacy, and it assumes that the people completing the questionnaires on their own will understand the questions that you have posed, because it won't really give them a chance to ask for clarity. So in that design, you have to be a lot more clear in terms of the questions that you ask and the wording that you use and so on. However, it's much quicker and easier to obtain information that way. Okay, so you decide on, depending on what your target population is, whether you will use face-to-face interviews or let them complete it themselves, self-administered. Steps 3 and 4 are to decide on the question content and develop the question wording. So here, this could possibly be the most difficult part of the development of the questionnaires. In terms of types of questions that you can use in a quantitative closed-ended questionnaire or a formal structured questionnaire, these are just examples of the different types that you can use, and a good questionnaire will contain a mix of most of these types of questions. So you guys all know about multiple choice questions. That's where a question is posed and there are up to 5 or 6 different options provided, and a person can choose the one option that best suits their response. Okay. Again, these must be mutually exclusive and exhaustive categories that they can choose from. Okay, don't make it too difficult for them to choose. Then you can also get multiple response questions where a person is allowed, they're designed specifically to allow more than one option to be chosen. For example, a question that asks patients which symptoms they are experiencing. So if you are looking at maybe asthma patients, you can ask them what symptoms are they experiencing today, and list shortness of breath, wheezing, coughing, tight chest, and a variety of other symptoms. And they must tick the symptoms that they are experiencing, and they are allowed to choose more than one. This has implications for how you will capture the data. So when we do a session on data management, multiple response will be dealt with there. Binary variables are obviously just having 2 options, and both are mutually exclusive and exhaustive, and for instance, yes or no. So you can ask a question and the answer can either be a yes or no. But you must be careful if there's no in-between possibility, like a participant could be not sure, or sometimes yes, sometimes no. So binary variables where there's only yeses and nos, or dead or alive, or pregnant or not pregnant, you must be sure that there's only two possible options. Otherwise, give them another option. Scales, like Likert scales, so just I like my example. I don't know who else is a Game of Thrones fan here, but it usually gives you a scale to respond on with a numerical, with a number, on how strongly you agree with the particular subject. So it could be a statement given, like, for instance, chiropractors and physiotherapists perform the same therapy. Now, and then you'd be presented with a scale from 1 to 5, from strongly disagree to strongly agree, and then you need to mark along that scale how strongly you agree with that statement. There could also be open-ended questions where you would insert a number, like, for instance, if you were asked what your age is, or your number of children that you have, or number of people that live in your household. And also you could get visual analog scales. Now, visual analog scales, I'll show you in the next slide. So here's some examples of the different types of questions. So binary questions would be something like, have you experienced low back pain in the last 30 days? And the two options you're given are just yes and no. We just want to work out what's the prevalence of low back pain in the last 30 days, and you either have or you haven't. There might still be people who don't know or can't remember, but you're forcing people to say yes or no. A Likert scale, this is the example I gave about the chiropractor and the physiotherapist performing similar roles from a scale of strongly disagree to strongly agree. The open-ended questions are such. And the visual analog scale could be, for instance, severity of pain, like something like pain which is difficult to measure with an instrument. You have to measure it on self-report, and you could either ask them to give you a number between 0 and 100, in which case it's just a numerical rating scale. But a visual analog scale gives a little bit more than that. It's a sort of a visual idea of how severe their pain is. You give them a line from none to unbearable, and you ask them to make a cross somewhere along the line about where their pain is. Obviously, it's very subjective. But then what you would do is measure in millimeters from the end of the left side of the line to where the middle of their cross is, and that would be the way that you can quantify how they're rating their pain. Before we do this, we're going to run a poll now. So the first poll is, what type of question would be most appropriate to measure people's attitudes towards something? So if you're asking what are the people's attitudes, would you use a multiple choice question, multiple response, binary, Likert scale, or open-ended? If you could please all just click on the option that you think would be the best one to measure people's attitudes towards something. So if you're maybe doing a study on people's attitudes towards people with HIV, yeah, attitudes are something that there's not like a right and a wrong answer. It's more of a continuum, or a sort of a gray area. So how would you best measure people's attitudes? Okay, so far 70% have said Likert scale and 25% have said multiple response. Are there more people that are wanting to commit? 80% say Likert scale. Nobody said open-ended or binary or multiple choice. Great, 86% Likert scale. Some people changing their minds now. Right, if everybody has voted, more people changing their minds now. Right, there's somebody saying open-ended, good. Okay, so if we're doing a quantitative study and we want to measure attitudes, we probably wouldn't use an open-ended question. That would be more along the lines of qualitative research. Then we would let people write their own stories. But those would be very, very difficult to analyze if we're doing a quantitative study. So we would analyze open-ended questions more for the qualitative studies. If we wanted to test people's attitudes towards something in a quantitative questionnaire, like a KAPB study, knowledge, attitudes, practices, and beliefs, which are usually quite quantitative, then we would definitely use a Likert scale. Okay, so the Likert scale is probably from strongly disagree to strongly agree, with some statements, pre-specified statements, and then we would see how strongly people agreed with those statements. Okay, those people who put multiple response, that would be possible, but probably not as easy as a Likert scale question, which would allow you to quantify your strength of agreement with something. Okay, is everybody on board here? So let's now move on to the next aspect, which is the wording of the questionnaire. As we know, the way that we word something can definitely influence the validity and the reliability of the data. It's best to use plain and clear language tailored to the type of participants that you are having in your study. So if your participants are highly educated doctors, you're not going to patronize them by, using very simple language. But again, you don't want to pitch the language at something that they might not understand. Again, if you're looking at the man on the street, you have to be sure that they would understand what you're asking them. Avoiding leading words is very important. Don't make it seem judgmental. Don't make your questions seem to be judging somebody by using words that have a negative connotation. Slang and culture-specific words, for obvious reasons, can be problematic. This is something that a lot of people do without even realizing it. They ask more than one question at a time. So the way to avoid that is just to look and see that you're not using the word "and" in your question, okay? We'll come to some examples of that just now. Double negatives can be highly confusing and lead to very invalid results. So another way to avoid that is just to not use the word "not" in your questions. Don't make assumptions. For instance, if you ask a question, what kind of computer do you have? And then you give two options, Apple, Mac, and IBM. That's assuming that they have a computer. What about people who don't have a computer? Or what about if there are other types of computers that you haven't listed there? And also to make sure that the answers match the question. This sounds extremely obvious, but you'd be surprised how many times that happens where the answers given don't actually match the question. And when you're designing a questionnaire, you can find that you can become a little bit stable blind. Okay, so you are on a specific mission and you might not take a step back and look and see what you're not seeing. So it's best to sort of give your colleague the questions that you're designing, just to check these sort of things from time to time. I mean, apart from piloting the questionnaire, which you're going to do once you've compiled everything. So, okay, so some examples of poorly worded questions are something like this. Where's the hospital located? Urban area, rural area, city. So what could be the problem here? Well, I'm sure you can see that the city and the urban area are possibly the same response. So people who live in an urban area or a city would not know how to respond. Would they put A, urban area, or C, city? So just make sure that your options are mutually exclusive. This is an example of where your options are not mutually exclusive. Are you against drug abuse? No and yes. I mean, what do you expect a person to say here? Of course you expect them to say yes. But because it's worded in such a way as to use leading and sort of biased words. Do you like the color and design of the book's cover? No or yes. So what can you see? What's the problem here? Well, here we're asking two questions at the same time. We're asking, do you like the color and the design? So what about if they like the color but not the design, or vice versa? How would they respond? So that's where you would look for that word "and," because that could indicate that you're asking more than one question. Okay, time for another poll. What is the problem with the question below? I do not feel depressed. And the options you're given are no and yes. Does it have leading words, slang or culture-specific words? Does it ask more than one question at a time, or does it have a double negative? Okay, so far people are going with double negative. Think about that question, I do not feel depressed. If you say no, what does it mean? Are you depressed or aren't you depressed? Okay, some people are saying asks more than one question at a time. Double negative is in the lead at the moment. Okay, everybody, has everyone had a chance to click on their option? Okay, so asking more than one question would probably have that word "and" in the question, and this one doesn't have the word "and" in the question, so it's really just asking one question. Leading words, I suppose depressed could be a leading word, but I guess there might not be another way to ask it in this case. So majority of you are saying that it's a double negative, which is correct because it's got that word not in it. So when you say no, you're actually saying that you do feel depressed, right? And if you're saying yes, then you're saying you're not depressed. So it can be highly confusing to the people who are answering your questionnaire. And therefore, if it's confusing like this, it could lead to invalid results. The next step, step 5, is to decide on the order of the questions and to format it. Don't forget we need to include, if applicable, informed consent as a separate page before the questionnaire, and to also note the confidentiality aspects. We might need an introductory paragraph or cover letter, so this would be mainly in the case of questionnaires that are self-administered. Otherwise, if you're doing a one-to-one interview with a participant, you can cover all these aspects when you speak to the participant. Tell them all about the study, what it's about, and the aims and objectives, and so on. Clear instructions would be needed, especially in the case of a self-administered questionnaire. It really helps your questionnaire to be spacious and uncluttered and easily navigable by the participants. It does also pay to group questions on similar subject matter together. For instance, if you're doing a knowledge, attitudes and practices study, all your knowledge questions would probably come under one heading and be grouped together, followed by your attitudes questions and so on. You wouldn't really scatter them throughout the questionnaire, although there might be reason for doing that if you don't want people to sort of just answer the same way for the same questions, if you want them to think a little bit about the question itself. Usually we put the demographics at the beginning of the questionnaire, so asking them their age, their gender, their education level, and any other demographic information you want. This is kind of like an icebreaker. It helps them to just get started, get settled in to the questionnaire, and then asking the less sensitive questions. If your questionnaire does contain sensitive questions, to not put them right at the beginning and scare off your participants before they've even started. However, having said that, the important questions should be near the beginning or near the middle. Don't leave the very important questions to right near the end, because sometimes participants have, especially if it's self-administered, they have a tendency to get bored and stop completing the questionnaire halfway through, and then you're missing your important questions. So get those important questions in near the beginning, but not right at the beginning. You want to gain their trust first with some more friendly questions and then hit them with the very sensitive stuff. Checkboxes are nice for closed-ended questions where people can just tick in the box of the response that they're wanting to do, rather than to circle a response or have a more sort of difficult way of responding. And again, keep it short and simple. My most important instruction to you. Step 6 and 7 is to check the length and to pilot the questionnaire. Usually we just select a small number of respondents for the pre-test, and they have to kind of be broadly representative of the type of respondent that we want to interview for the main study. However, their responses will not be included in our main study, right? If the questionnaire has been subjected to a thorough pilot test, the final form of the questions and the questionnaire will have evolved. All that remains to be done is the mechanical process of laying out and setting up the questionnaire in its final form. So the purpose of pre-testing would be to find out which questions can be dropped, if the questions are correctly worded and understood, the order of the questions if it's okay, and if additional instructions are needed. Step 8 is to validate. Data are only as good as the instruments used to measure them. So validity is the extent to which what you're measuring with your questionnaire is the truth. And there are many different types of validity and different ways of measuring it. We can get face validity, which is kind of the most simple type of validity, which asks, are the items assessing what you want them to assess? And basically that would be where you would get a group of content experts, and they would all sit around a boardroom table and discuss whether these items are correctly assessing what you want them to assess. And content validity is another type of validation where we ask, do the questions in the questionnaire measure correctly and thoroughly the concept you're intending to measure? That's tested using other methods. So we can test both of them through focus groups and content experts. If a gold standard exists, we can compare responses on the questionnaire with the gold standard to assess the content validity. But if you're measuring an abstract concept like suicidal ideation, there is no gold standard except if the person eventually goes and commits suicide. So obviously you don't want to wait for that to happen. So you have to look at content validity using something else rather than a gold standard. And then we also get internal consistency, which is basically more important for questionnaires that have items that make up a scale or a construct. And dimensionality can be measured. Basically, we can measure the extent to which all of those items are measuring the same construct. So if you're measuring, let's say, depression, you can have maybe 10 questions that measure a certain construct about depression. And you would expect that people answer the same way to each of those questions because all of those questions measure one particular thing. And if there's one item in that, in those 10 questions that is being answered completely differently to all the other items, that's probably a problematic item or problematic question. And that can be identified using something called Cronbach's alpha. So this is something like, it's almost a type of reliability rather than validity, although it is also validity because it's saying how good are these items at measuring this particular construct? Are they internally consistent? And then lastly, reliability testing. That measures the extent to which the results of your study are repeatable, basically. And test-retest reliability is one of the ways that we can do this, and it's quite easy to do. A sample of the same participants are retested a second time after you've left a suitable time period to elapse, and then you compare the results of the previous test with the post-test. We also have responsiveness or sensitivity as a form of reliability testing. It's the ability of a tool to detect small changes in individuals over time. So it's only important really for longitudinal studies. A questionnaire is not valid or reliable if it's not sensitive to small change. An example is we have a quality of life scale which produce scores, and those scores, if we test participants over long periods of time, can remain static. They can remain almost exactly the same and not change over time, even if clinically the participants' clinical status changes very much over that time. Their quality of life scale can remain static. So quality of life is then deemed as not a very sensitive scale to measure small changes over time. Validity and reliability testing can take a long time and can actually be studies in themselves. So be sure to plan adequately for validity and reliability testing if needed. And do consider the scope of your study when you're planning this. So I've known people whose entire PhD has been around designing a new tool to measure something and to do all the validity and reliability testing. So yes, it can be an entire PhD. So just be aware that depending on what it is you're trying to measure, it can take a lot of time. And finally, step 9 is to finalize the questionnaire in terms of the layout, coding, and possibly looking at skip logic. Coding is basically, if you want to, you may want to indicate your coding for categorical variables on the questionnaire itself. So as we know, when we enter the data into the spreadsheet, if we've got categorical variables, we should enter them as numeric codes. Simplest example would be if the sex of the person can be male or female. A 1 could be used to represent male and a 2 could be used to represent female. You might want to put that coding onto your questionnaire itself so that when you're capturing the data, it's easy to see what the coding is and what means what. Skip logic can help you to, it's also known as conditional branching, and it helps to route the respondents through the questionnaire in case of not applicable answers. So they don't have to go through the whole lot of questions if it's not applicable to them. I'm not sure if you can see this example here. a question might be, how long have you worked at Big Rock Company? And if the user answers the question or does not answer the question, or chooses between a certain range or does not choose between a certain range, then you can jump to specific questions or skip specific questions. So you might have to just figure that out to make it easier for participants to complete the questionnaire without wasting time. Okay, so that was a very lengthy process to go through all of those steps that are required, and I've only just touched the surface of all of those steps. So obviously each of those steps involves a hell of a lot more than what I've actually said. After this, we're going to just do a final poll and then we'll be done. So, okay, we have a question. Do questionnaires need to go through ethical approval? How would the timing of that work? Would the questionnaire be a part of the original ethics proposal? Thanks, Andrew, for your question. Yes, most definitely. The Ethics Committee, the IRB, will definitely need to see what kind of questions you're asking in its final form, right? So you will include your questionnaire in your ethics approval for your IRB. How would the timing of that work? It will be, you'll have to design your questionnaire at the same time as you are designing your, well, obviously you write your protocol first, and then you design your questionnaire or data collection form. You would have to then also do some pre-testing probably before going for ethics. So the very initial face validation can be done before ethics, but the piloting, if you're going to pilot your questionnaire, that needs to be done only after ethical approval is obtained. So yes, there might be changes to be made to your questionnaire after obtaining ethical approval. And for the most part, those changes can be just dealt with as a simple letter to the Ethics Committee informing them of the wording of the changing or whatever you're dropping, or new questionnaire, as long as no substantially ethically compromising questions have been added to the questionnaire. If you decide to add questions that you hadn't initially got approval for, then you will probably have to either submit a protocol amendment or, in extreme cases, go through a whole new ethical review. But usually just after piloting, it's just minor changes that get made, and it can then simply be updating the Ethics Committee with a letter and saying, this is the changes after piloting, we've just made some wording changes, some editing, and da-da-da. So it's not usually a big problem. But yes, the Ethics Committee most definitely needs to know exactly what questions you're planning on answering, and if there's huge changes to be made, it has to go through as a protocol amendment. Hope that answers your question, Andrew. And then Anozi says, how do we get the questionnaires that have already been designed? So there you would do in your literature search and your literature review, you would come across those other studies that are very similar to yours, and you'd see what tool they used. If they don't actually publish the tool with the article, you can write to the principal researcher. They always include an email address of the PI in the article, and hopefully he or she responds to your email, and then you can discuss the terms on which you get to use the questionnaire. Sometimes, as I said, they ask for money, for payment. Sometimes they want to be co-author or co-investigator or co-author, or just to be acknowledged on your paper. Sometimes it's good enough just to be acknowledged and to have your paper cited in the reference section of their paper, because that all counts as citations, and then it increases the distribution, or the awareness about your particular research. I just had a student the other day, just completed his master's in clinical epidemiology, and he designed his own questionnaire from scratch about immunization. And he already has 2 people who've written to him to ask if they can use or adapt his questionnaire. And he's not sure how to handle that. Should he ask to be a co-investigator if they're going to adapt it? Because you obviously want to have some control. If this questionnaire is your baby and you've spent a lot of time and effort designing it, you might want to have some control or some say in what adaptations get made to it, right? So then you want to be a co-investigator in their study. So that would be your terms on which you would then let them have access to your questionnaire. So you'd have to design a whole MOU that you can sign and they can sign and adhere to. Do you understand why it's necessary to go through all these steps when designing a questionnaire from scratch? So if you could just indicate whether you've understood all these things. If you have further questions, you're welcome to ask them now or to email me after the webinar and we can discuss it. Right, most people are saying yes, so I'm happy that at least you've understood what I've said or seen the need for this. So yeah, thanks very much everybody.